Hi everybody. So as we discussed earlier this week for today's meeting, I have made for you a video because I have to give a guest lecture for another class, the Intro to Philosophy class. I've included that information in the La Lima post about this video if any of you are interested in attending. Now, what I want to cover today is to just pick up where we left off in the end of our Monday class. And at that point, we had begun an initial discussion of Vasubandhu's commitments as an Abhidharmika and some of the ways in which he's relating to himself, both as a Sarvastivadin thinker and as a Sautrantika thinker. Now, what I want to do in this video lecture for today is begin our discussion of Vasubandhu's arguments against the Atman. And so you're going to need your handout in order to get through this lecture. And we're going to begin our discussion at the bottom of the 4th page of the handout. And what we're going to do is we're going to read from a passage of Vasubandhu. And this passage actually comes from page 288 and 289 of the Buddhist philosophy book. So you can follow along there or on the handout as you'd like. So here's what Vasubandhu has to say. He says, "It is known that the expression of self refers to a continuum of aggregates and not to anything else, because direct perception and correct inference establish that the phenomena in dependence upon which a person is conceived are the aggregates, and there is no direct perception or correct inference of anything else among these phenomena. If anything else exists among these phenomena, its existence would have to be established by direct perception or correct inference. For of all phenomena that exist, there is direct perception that establishes their existence, and there is of the 6 objects in the mental organ, as there is of the 6 objects in the mental organ, unless direct perception of them is impeded, or there is correct inference that establishes their existence, as there is of the 5 sense organs." Okay, so clearly, that passage is quite a mouthful. And as we proceed through the Abhidharmic literature, and also further on from there through the Madhyamaka and Yogacara and later Buddhist epistemology and logic, you're going to encounter, similar to what you encountered with Buddhaghosa, these extremely dense passages. And so what we're going to try and do in the following weeks is to unpack these dense packages and render them into a clear form of argument, so you can get a sense of what is actually being claimed and what the logic of the arguments is. So what I've done on your handout is I've attempted to give a schema of this argument. And the first thing that I put as the premise, the first premise of the argument is the following. For something to exist as a conditioned phenomena, that is, as something that arises and passes away in space and time according to relations of cause and effect, that's what it means for something to be a conditioned phenomenon. For something to exist as such, we must be able to establish its existence by either direct perception or correct inference. Now, this emphasis on direct perception and correct inference is something that will be taken up by many other Buddhist philosophers, most notably Dignaga and Dharmakirti, who we'll look at very near to the end of the course. Now, what this emphasis is trying to show us is that the Buddhist philosophers from Vasubandhu onwards, though the Madhyamaka philosophers will depart from this a little bit, have a very strong view about what is called pramana. Now, pramana theory is a feature of Indian epistemology more generally. And so one of the ways that Buddhist philosophical schools and non-Buddhist philosophical schools would fight with each other is about what counts as pramana and what doesn't. So a pramana is, for our purposes, a pramana is something like a valid means of knowing. It is a way of taking up with the world, and when it works properly, yields something like knowledge. So Vasubandhu, as well as his forebears, Dignagandharmakirti, they will claim that there are only two pramanas. And those pramanas are direct perception and correct inference. So if you have direct perception of a phenomena and there are no defeaters around, there's no reasons to think that that connection is faulty in any way. If you have a direct perception of something, then you can claim to know something about it. That direct perception is a pramana. Similarly, inference, correct inference, not false inference, but correct inference, if you can infer on the basis of available evidence to a conclusion, that's also a valid means of knowing something. It's also a pramana. Now, it's important to note in this regard that other schools list many, many more pramanas. Now, you might, actually before I get to the next point, let me just list a few of them for you. So two that we've already seen are perception and inference. Others include comparison or analogy, derivation, scriptural authority, the testimony of others. So you might think if someone who you really trust tells you something, that in virtue of believing that testimony, that you might be said to know something, namely what they told you. So, as should be clear from our previous discussion of the Kalama Sutta several weeks ago, the Buddhists tend to be very conservative about what will count as pramana and what won't. And so for them, they will deny, at least Vasubandhu, will deny that anything outside of perception and inference will count as a proper form of knowing. So that's why in the passage that we just read, we see him emphasizing very strongly that the only way you could conclude that something actually exists, and here the paradigm that they're concerned with is a self. The only way you could establish the existence of a self is on the basis of direct perception of it, or an inference to the conclusion that it exists on the basis of sufficient evidence. So this first premise of the argument represents an epistemic condition that must be met in order for something to be able to be claimed to exist. Sorry about that. He then claims that direct perception of the five aggregates is there and therefore establishes their existence as valid. He then further claims that there is no correct inference or direct perception of a self. It therefore immediately follows that the notion of a self can only refer to a collection of the five aggregates, because those are the only things that might hold the place of a self that are directly perceived or can be established on the base of a correct inference. Now, this isn't actually a very good argument. And the reason it's not a good argument is that it will not convince anyone who isn't already a Buddhist of its conclusion. Why is that? Because the second premise of the argument, direct perception of the five aggregates establishes their existence as valid. And further, the third premise of the argument, there is no correct inference or direct perception of a self, is a very flat-footed way of just stating the Buddhist position. A non-Buddhist philosopher would not take these premises very seriously. A lot more subsequent argument would be necessary in order for a non-Buddhist to get on board with these two premises. For example, there are plenty of Indian philosophical traditions that would claim that on the basis of certain types of meditative experiences, that the self can be directly witnessed. So it's actually quite difficult to use this argument to convince someone of its conclusion who isn't already on board with the Buddhist program. But the point of parsing it out for you is twofold. First, to show you that it's possible. And second, And more importantly, when we pair this kind of argument up with previous arguments we've seen, in particular arguments that focus on impermanence and dukkha, like we saw in the Anattalakkhana Sutta, for example. In those situations, when we think about those arguments in conjunction with these, we actually have a much stronger picture, because it gives us some insight into what's motivating the Buddhist philosophical psychology and how the systematic arguments get built up on the basis of those motivations. So, what I'd like to do now is consider a very general form of argument that Vasubandhu will be interacting with in the passages that I had you read. And I've parsed that argument at the bottom of the 5th page of the handout. And this argument is what I call the Tirthika argument against Vasubandhu, where the Tirthikas here are just a term that Vasubandhu uses to refer to non-Buddhist schools. And so here's the argument in a very general form. The first premise says, if there is no self, and minds are just momentary causal relations between the aggregates, which is the Buddhist view, then the mind cannot have mental functions equaling to x, where x is a variable that we'll plug in different values for in a minute. So just hold tight. Then the second premise is something like the mind does have these mental functions, which is a negation of the consequent of the conditional expressed in the first premise, which therefore entails a conclusion, the negation of the antecedent. So the conclusion is, therefore, there is a self and not just the momentary causal relations between the aggregates. So to understand this argument very abstractly for a moment, what I've done here is I've put it in the form of a modus tollens argument. Namely, the first premise is, if P, then Q. If there is no self and the mind and minds are just momentary causal relations between aggregates, P, then the mind cannot have mental functions X, Q. But the mind does have mental functions equaling X, not Q. Therefore, there is a self and not just the momentary causal relations between the aggregates, not P. So we've negated the consequent condition of the conditional in the first premise, and thereby derived the negation of the antecedent condition in the conclusion. If P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. Now, this argument isn't all that interesting unless we give it some content, because as you've no doubt noticed, the way that I framed the argument in both premises 1 and 2, there is no content for the kinds of mental functions that we're talking about. So if we turn the page to page 6, we can start to bootstrap this argument a little bit. But understanding the general schema is helpful, because what the argument basically says is, look, here are some things, basic realities of our mental life that everyone can agree we have. So for example, our capacity to use our memories, our capacity to apprehend objects in perception, our capacity for intentional action. The Tirthika argument is going to be something like this. We have the capacity for these basic mental functions. And the Buddhist philosopher will surely have to agree with that. The point of the argument is to get them to agree with that by making that premise completely uncontroversial. Then the further claim is made that if all we are is a momentary fluctuating aggregation of mental and physical moments, then we can't perform these basic mental functions. But we do perform these basic mental functions. Therefore, it's not the case that we are just a fluctuating series of aggregates. So the debate here in general can be boiled down to a disagreement about whether massive causal connectiveness and accumulation between momentary mental and physical events is on its own enough to explain basic cognitive functions that we all will agree are things that we're able to do. Like remember past experiences, for example. Of course we can all remember past experiences. But if we can, does that entail that we have a self? Or can we explain the recall of past experiences merely in terms of the causal connections between the aggregates? Vasubandhu will of course argue that it is enough for us to explain basic mental functions in terms of massive causal accumulation. The non-Buddhist opponent will deny this and claim that without something existing in the mind over and above this shifting coalition of momentary mental and physical events, we will be unable to explain how it is that we can perform these basic mental functions. So one way of plugging in a specific content to the argument that I outlined at the beginning, at the end of page 5, is intentional action. So let's do that. Let's think about the idea of intentional action. So intentional action is the kind of action we take when we have a very strong intention to perform a certain action. So if I am feeling, for example, overwhelmed with the number of papers that I have to grade. Here they are. I will form a very strong intention to grade those papers anyway in a timely fashion so that I can get them back to you. Now, the question is, can I form an intention to act, and then can I then act on that intention? Grade those papers. Is my capacity to do that dependent on there being an agent back here? Is my capacity to act intentionally entail that I am an agent who can act? Or can we account for my intentional action merely in terms of the causal connections between the aggregates? So to plug that information into my argument schema at the bottom of page 5, we would yield something like the following. If there is no self and minds are just the momentary causal relations between the aggregates, then the mind cannot perform intentional action. But the mind does have the capacity to perform intentional action. Therefore, there is a self, not just momentary causal relations between the aggregates. That's a basic argument. So Vasubandhu has a reply to this argument. And the argument is going to be, I've parsed it out from page 299 of this. And I've parsed it in the following way. Premise 1. All that is required for agency is an appropriate causal relation between an intention and an action, forming an unbroken continuum. So what matters for intentional action, according to Vasubandhu, is just that there is an unbroken continuum. Okay? Second premise. Momentary mental events related appropriately in a causal stream can provide this relation, namely this unbroken continuum between intention and action. No soul or self is required. Therefore, it follows it is not the case that if there is no self, that the mind cannot have intentional action. The quote from page 299 that's relevant here is, Devadatta is no more than momentary caused entities that form an unbroken continuum. Fools who presuppose that the cause of the appearance of the continuum in a different place is a single being, a body, say that Devadatta walks. They call the arising of the continuum in another location walking. In our view, the walking of Devadatta is like the propagation of sound or the spread of fire. In the same way, thinking that the cause of consciousness is a unitary being, fools say that Devadatta is conscious. Hearing them say this, the noble ones say the same thing in order to confirm the received usage. So the idea here is that all you need to explain intentional action is a right type of causal connection between the arising of intention and the performance of an action. And if there's a continuum of mental events that are properly connected, you can get an explanation of intentional action. Now, the relevant objection here, of course, will be to reject the second premise and say that the self or soul is something over and above the changing momentary flux of the contents of our experience. The way that this objection gets put, Vasubandhu puts this objection in the mouth of an opponent, and this is on page 305 of the same text. It says, if there is no soul, who is the agent of the action, and who is the recipient of the consequences of the action? Vasubandhu replies, well, what do you mean by agent or recipient? The opponent says, he who acts is the agent, he who receives is the recipient. And Vasubandhu says, these are synonyms, not definitions, which is his way of saying, you've actually assumed what you seek to prove by claiming that it is my responsibility to provide an account that satisfies the distinction between agent and recipient. But I deny that there are any such beings. I merely account for what appears to be those such kinds of beings in terms of the causal connectedness of various mental events. And as long as the causal stream between those events is properly organized, then I have an account. So the disagreement is about whether we require an unchanging principle that stays the same across the changes in us that exist between the forming of an intention and the performance of an action on the basis of that intention. Obviously, Vasubandhu is going to deny that there is such an agent. But we can see the reason why you might think there needs to be such an agent. Namely, that in order for the continuity of our conscious life to be continuous in the right way, such that the formation of an intention at one moment is a suitable cause for an intentional action at another moment, those two mental events need to be properties of one and the same subject. How else are we going to individuate between the formation of my intention and an action that you perform? Clearly, that's a distinction we want to maintain. How might it be maintained without a principle of individuality that makes my stream of mental events, in principle, different from yours? And that the mental events that arise within the framework of my stream of consciousness are mine. And that's why the intentional action is performed by me. Now, here's a very ingenious argument that Vasubandhu offers in reply to this kind of reasoning. Namely, the kind of reasoning that posits the existence of an independent self or soul-like entity that owns or possesses or sits on top of in some way the changing, fluctuating mental events that occur between the formation of an intention and the performance of an intentional action. The argument is laid out on page 305. I'm going to read the passage to you, and then I'll parse the argument. Oh, I apologize. I've given you the wrong... I might have given you the wrong... Oh, never mind. No. I apologize. Page 305, as I mentioned. There's a big paragraph in the middle of the page where Vasubandhu lays out the view. It goes like this. Now, he is the totality of the five... Now, is he the totality of the five aggregates? This is asking about the designation of Devadatta. We would consider that to be the agent. Action is of three types: bodily, vocal, and mental. Bodily action is dependent on the functioning of the mind. The functioning of the mind as regards the body is dependent on its own causes in the same way. Nothing has any kind of independence. all beings arise in dependence on contributing causes. Even if we were to admit that the soul is not caused and doesn't depend on anything, that would not prove that something has independence. Therefore, this characteristic of independence does not apply to any agent at all. Whatever is the principal cause of an action, that is called the agent. And the soul has no causal efficacy at all. Therefore, the soul should not be considered as an agent. From memory arises intention, from intention thought, from thought exertion, from exertion a wind in the body, and from this wind comes the action. What does the soul do in the process? Okay, so what is the argument here? It's something like this. If the soul were uncaused and independent, that is, if the soul did not, the claim is that the soul exists over and above the fluctuating change of mental events, which means it's not subject to the same laws of causation that the events are, which arise in dependence on causes and effects. But if that's the case, and the soul is outside the chain of cause in mental events and independent, then the soul would not be able to cause anything. Because in order to cause anything, you need to be subject to the laws of causation. That's the presupposition. So one way to deny this argument would be to say, well, actually, there's a special kind of causation the soul can have. That is, it exerts influence over other things, but is not itself at the same time the byproduct of a cause. But that's a weird view to hold. So Vasubandhu reasons that if the soul were uncaused and independent, then the soul would not be able to cause anything. You're either fully in the mesh of causation or you're outside of it. There's no halfway house in between. But if the soul, this is the second premise now, if the soul were unable to cause anything, then it would have no role to play in a theory of intentional action, which is about the causal connections between the formation of an intention, the exertion of effort, and the performance of an intentional action on the basis of that intention. Therefore, either the soul exists and doesn't do what it's supposed to do in a theory of action, or there is no independent soul at all. Which is why Vasubandhu says, look, the agent is just whatever causes the action. Whatever mental event causes the action, that's the agent. There's not something over and above the stream of mental events besides that. Okay? And that's why Vasubandhu says in the passage that I just cited that nothing has any kind of independence. All beings arise in dependence on the contributing causes. Now, Vasubandhu's approach here is not without its difficulties. And so what I want to do now is we're going to raise an objection or problem for this approach. And we won't really have the opportunity to fully flesh out what this objection means and how to respond to it until next week. We're going to spend all of next week thinking about this problem as it's played out in a debate between Vasubandhu and a school of Buddhist philosophy that has come to be called the Pudgalavadan school. But for now, what I want to do is just raise this problem for Vasubandhu, and we'll leave our discussion there and pick up next time. So here's the problem. In a number of places in the text that you read for this week, Vasubandhu refers to the stream of aggregates as an unbroken continuum, and that having an unbroken continuum is the condition for explaining the mental functions. So where non-Buddhist schools will posit an entity like a self as the principle for explaining the performance of certain mental functions, in our case, the performance of intentional actions, Vasubandhu says instead of positing a self, what we posit is an unbroken continuum of mental events that eventually cause the wind in the body to animate our actions. Okay? Now, the objection here is that, and here's a quote, if the body could support an identification of the self, why don't we identify ourselves with the bodies of others? Okay? If the body is enough, if the continuity where is this? And then Vasubandhu replies, he says, if the body could support an identification of the, he says, The identification of the self arises from the connection involving the body and the mind. It won't occur with respect to a body that is not part of the continuum in question. This process has been repeating itself eternally in beginningless cyclic existence. So the question is, look, why is it, if all there is causal connection, why don't my intentions cause your actions? Why is it that my intentions only work with my physical actions if there's no self? Vasubandhu says, well, because there's a special connection between the mind and the body. They condition each other. And your body is not part of this continuum, the continuum of my mind and body. Okay, there's a distinction there he's leaning on. But here's the question then. If what individuates bodies and minds is a special causal connection between them, how do we keep those streams apart? In virtue of what? This is what I put it on your handout at the bottom, middle of page 7. In virtue of what can it be said of a series of causally connected mental events that they belong to one particular continuum rather than another? We can't say, well, these experiences are mine and yours are yours. Because that would just be recruit the language of selfhood and ownership in a way that would give the non-Buddhists what they want. All that we can posit is connections between events. But if that's all we have, then it's not clear what the principle of individuation is going to be for explaining the causal connections between mental and physical events, not only in this life, but between lives. Right? Think about it. If my body dies at the end of this life, how does my karmic action, how does my karma now bear fruit in the next life in a way that's separate and different from the fruit that your actions will yield now? What is the principle of individuation for minds and bodies in this life and the next? If it's just causation, then how can we keep these things distinct? That's the puzzle. That's the puzzle. Why don't my intentions cause your actions? Why don't your injuries cause my pains? There's something about us that keeps us distinct, such that my pains and my goals and my memories are uniquely and privately accessible by me and not by you. What is the principle that explains that difference, that does not reify the causally aggregated stream of mind moments into a single self? That's the question. And what we'll see next week when we talk about this more carefully is the Pudgalavadan school is going to take this question very seriously. And they're going to try and say, well, look, there isn't such a thing as a self, an Atman, but there is a person, a Pudgala. And then this idea will come in for very strong critique from both Vasubandhu as well as Madhyamaka philosophers. Okay, so just to take stock of where we've gone today, I've moved through the rest of the handout at a fair clip, and we've come to the end of that. So on Friday when we meet, we'll go back over this carefully in response to your guidance. So anything that isn't clear to you from what we've discussed or what I've discussed today, I want you to bring those questions to the class on Friday, and our Friday class will be more of a conversation about what Vasubandhu is up to, and then we'll move on from there to his debate with the Pudgalavadins in the week following. Okay, see you on Friday.